Microphone.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to our press conference. I'm Megan Darby from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. This is a press conference about Europe's dash for gas in Africa and the risks of depending on LNG projects for development. We have here on the panel Denis Guerrier from the Natural Resources Governance Institute. We have Vance Colbert, who will be presenting the findings of our latest report authored by South African colleagues at IISD. And we will also have Karabo Mokonyana from PowerShift Africa, who's just joining the stage now, talking. So without further ado, I will hand over to Denis to set the scene. Take it away, Denis.
Hi, thanks very much, Megan. I think this is really an important subject, of course, because of where Africa's development trajectory is. We're grappling with the energy transition in Africa. But in addition to that, we also have about 600 million Africans who lack access to electricity. And in many parts of Africa, gas is relied upon as a fuel to sort of generate most of the electricity that is supplied to homes. Besides this energy poverty question, we also have about 1 billion people who still cook their meals in open fires using traditional sources like firewood, like kerosene, charcoal, animal waste. And in particular, we think that if gas projects must be developed, the target must be to address most of these questions domestically on the African continent and not directed at external consumption. We know that many Africans are also interested and have plans actually to industrialize their economies. And it's important that these gas projects in the short to medium term play into the agenda that these African countries have and not directed at external demand from Europe and other places. On the other hand, whilst we are seeing some increase in development of gas projects, particularly for the transition, we are also seeing that investment flows into the renewable energy space globally is reducing, and the African continent is just attracting about 3% of renewable energy investments, whilst the chunk of it is directed outside of the continent. The continuous sort of investments outside the continent of renewable energy and the emphasis on developing gas projects on the continent has the potential to really lock African governments into a long-term dependency situation that would get them indebted, and particularly also considering that renewable energy prices sort of are coming down. This serves as an opportunity to harvest or harness the vast renewable energy potential of African continent, rather than using these investments that could have gone into renewable energy or clean energy into gas projects that have questionable profitability and impact on these economies. Just wanted to make another third point on the narrative around gas in Africa. And for those of you who have been following, Nigeria developed its energy transition framework sometime 2022. Ghana followed and launched this energy transition framework. And all of these frameworks are emphasizing gas as a transition fuel. In fact, in the past few months, you often hear about gas as a destination fuel, meaning that these countries do not see themselves moving away from developing gas projects. And in the context of the transition, I think it's really a very weird situation that we have, where it's difficult to understand what kind of profitability analysis that have been done. And we think that most of these narratives are quite vague. They are quite emotionally charged and lack the needed evidence that suggests that gas can be a transition or even a destination fuel for these African countries, given that, again, renewables seems to have the trajectory of low prices coming up all the time. This agenda sort of also feeds into some of the decisions that are taken in countries like Europe to develop gas projects in Africa. Because if you say gas is your destination fuel, then you would have no way of questioning another country that is coming to develop those projects to satisfy its short-term needs. And we think that Africa should really refocus its ambitions around gas, especially as a transition fuel. Lastly, I wanted to just highlight the point that the decision by African countries to develop their gas, if any at all, should be directed again at domestic requirements, particularly in the short to medium term and not the long term. And I say this because countries like Ghana are looking to develop gas projects up to the mid-2050s, and that's what they have in their energy transition frameworks. We think that that time is really a long lead time. It takes away the opportunity to focus on renewables, and it locks these countries into indebtedness. And countries like Ghana are already on their 17th IMF bailout program, a highly indebted, currency crisis in countries like Ghana and Nigeria, which are all linked to some of these externally oriented fossil fuel development projects that we are seeing on the continent. And so on the whole, we think that gas projects with high cost in particular, so those that are mostly deep sea projects with high long break-even times, are really not the way to go. And we have a report at NRGI that we call the riskier bets, smaller pockets, and it analyzes different projects, oil and gas projects across the continent, particularly those driven by the national oil companies and the cost profile of these companies. And we think that it is really out of place for countries that are already indebted to be developing projects that have a high cost profile. And we think that generally we should refocus the thinking around LNG, the external orientation vis-a-vis the domestic requirements for some of these gas projects, and the long-term climate objectives that we need to actually collectively be working to achieve as a continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Vance.
Thanks very much, Dennis, for that discussion on also touching on domestic natural gas use. I want to talk today about European investment in natural gas exports, building on a study that our South African team recently did, who wasn't able to come here today to present this, particularly focusing on Mozambique, Nigeria, and Senegal. And it really appears that there is a weak economic case for many of these developments at the moment. And I'd like to go through some of those factors. Why is the economic case weak? Well, the world is expected to reach peak gas usage by 2030, according to IEA modeling, including even under the most conservative pathways of projections of modeling, which is called the STEPS pathway. Meanwhile, LNG capacity expanding globally. We expect capacity to increase by up to 40% by 2030. This means that there's going to be a coming glut in gas markets. We have expanding production and we have decreasing supply. And one of the main investors in expanding capacity at the moment is our European companies. European companies have been driving new investments after there's been a spike in prices across Europe. However, the way that these investments are being done often are benefiting European companies and do not necessarily benefit host countries. There's a range of reasons for this. Some of the reasons are the investment treaties themselves. In order to attract capital, often very unfavorable investment terms are agreed upon, in which the host countries agree that most of the initial income for these projects will go to pay off the capital investments from the companies. And we can be looking at horizons of 10 or 15 or even 20 years before significant revenues come to the host countries. And we know that 20 years from now, or 15 or even 10 years from now, the gas markets will look very different. and that there is therefore the risk that these will not be profitable at all. In addition, we know that there's significant energy efficiency programs being rolled out in the EU, the Repower EU efficiency plans, which could see 40% reduction in natural gas use in the coming decade, which will again impact the potential markets which all these investments are currently going into. So what happens if the bets on these projects don't work out as they're currently being billed? Well, we've seen this happen before with investments in many countries. Stranded assets, which are often left to the responsibility of host countries. We often see environmental cleanup, which is not paid for by investing companies who abandon fields, and this is also left to host countries. We also see long-term debt, sometimes as an co-equity investment by African countries in these investment programs. And if the programs fail to materialize in the long-term returns, then the host countries pile on increased national debt. We already know that there's enormous debt challenges in many of the countries who are currently having investments in their LNG projects. So I'd like to second what Dennis was saying about the need to carefully reconsider the economic case and be concerned about the long-term consequences of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Vance. Karabo.
Thank you so much. I'll start off with just contextualizing, the things that are needed by the African continent, but also in terms of partnerships. So the relationships that the African continent actually has, or what the African continent actually needs from European partners, developed countries. But the starting point, and I think it's important for me to mention this, is that the conversation on energy on the African continent is two-part. Yes, we want to respond to the climate crisis because we are feeling the effects. It's not some concept, far-fetched concept, it's a daily reality on the African continent and the rest of the global south. But there's also an energy access issue, and Dennis had mentioned the 600 million people who don't have access to clean energy. So it's a development conversation, it's a livelihoods conversation, it's a matter of energy access. So the need for a just transition is more urgent because of those two parts, the climate crisis, but the energy deficit that exists on the continent. And some of the things that we would want from a partnership perspective, or even just for our own African governments to look into, I'll piggyback off what Vance said and start off with the fair financing component. The indebtedness of African countries means we can no longer take on any more debt to drive any sort of just energy transitions, because it really does lock us into fossil fuel industries because the systems are there. We need fair financing towards renewable energy systems, clean energy systems, or just to facilitate the renewable energy component. And like Dennis had said, only 2% of investments come on the continent. So how are African countries expected to facilitate the just transition if only 2% of the investment is coming on the continent? So then there's a reliance on things like MDBs to finance the just transition, which means more debt. We are trapped into a system. We are already owing debts for fossil fuel. So at what point do African countries get to access fair financing that allows them to facilitate just transitions? But equally, different parties globally play a different part in the just transition. And it's important for us to not only view the African continent as, recipients and beggars in this conversation. There's actually a critical part that we play in this bigger conversation. The United States has market power in this conversation. China has market power in this conversation. Asia, the rest of Asia, Latin America, and Africa have the resources. So we need to start being viewed as an equal partner and contributor in this conversation on just transitions. And the reality is, if Africa decides nobody's going to touch our resources, we are all doomed. But that means that we need to start having this conversation from a mutual respect point of view. We are seeing a rise in green colonialism, and we don't want a replication of the models that we've seen in relation to fossil fuel industries and how then external entities come in and exploit the continent, and then that's that. In terms of the just transition and the conduciveness of the climate on the continent, there's enough for the continent, and Africa has the capacity to even produce a surplus for other parts of the world. So I guess the greediness just needs to go in terms of the exploitation that's happening. But also, a bigger part of this conversation tends to move away from locally driven solutions. It's really important for a lot of the clean energy conversation to be locally driven, because we then have large models of private sector financing that really take away from people. This is a people conversation. It's really not a conversation just about abstract ideas. It's about people getting energy access. It's about livelihoods. It's about sustainable development. And the climate crisis that is being experienced on the continent is affecting people. So it's important that these are locally driven, people-centered, community-centered, and are intersectional in nature. So the gender piece, the indigenous communities, all of that needs to be included within the bigger conversation. And then lastly, I'll just wrap up with the conversation on technology transfer. The tech is not on the continent, so when we have partnerships and we have collaborations, it's important for us to start having conversations about technology transfer. Yes, we have the critical minerals, yes, we have the resources, but the tech is sitting elsewhere. So how do we work together and collaborate to ensure that clean energy is, facilitated, but in a way that the power dynamics are really balanced? I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. So we now have 10 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And I think there's a roving mic somewhere. And when the mic comes to you, if you can introduce yourself with your name and your affiliation and ask your question, and let us know if you would like to direct it to a particular member of the panel. This gentleman first.
Thank you. I'm Neil Tharwadkar with Progressive International. Thank you for laying out the case against the economics. I was also interested if you have any specifics about concerns about human rights violations or workers' rights and gender that you would like to share, in addition to the economic case that you've already made against European investment in Africa.
Okay, so that was a question about do you have any human rights concerns? Would any of you, what are you seeing in terms of human rights of these LNG developments? Would anybody like to speak to that? Karabo? Yeah.
Yeah, I can. Let me just start off by saying that both the solutions and the fossil fuels are presenting human rights violations. And either way, some form of we need to really have human rights-centered approaches regardless of what it is. We are seeing it in relation to, for example, like I'm saying, the solutions, renewable energy, land grabs are happening, we're seeing lots of water scarcity and those kinds of issues. But at the same time, we're kind of replicating the same issues we're seeing in the LNG context. Health issues are emerging because a lot of these are within community context, especially in West African communities. So we see health issues are emerging, but also local industries are being killed. So there's, for example, in Senegal, the local fisher folks are being displaced as a result of the gas projects that are actually being done. So you've compromised economic development for local communities and local people who are relying on those kinds of industries. So we're seeing a lot more health and economic human rights being affected.
Dennis.
Yeah, just to add a bit to Karabo's point. Yes, there are significant human rights violations. Recall that from the upstream where the gas is actually extracted, whether it is onshore or offshore, these are places that people drive their livelihood, whether it's the fisher folks or the farmers whose lands are taken and given as concessions. In fact, if it is the fisher folks, there's a certain radius within which fisher folks cannot operate in the deep seas where oil installations are. In fact, there are myths across Africa that the lightning from FPSOs and all of the drilling rigs and all of that drives away fish stock, and therefore affects how much they are able to gain from this livelihood that they've depended on over the years. Onshore, there are pipelines in some cases that connect offshore gas, natural gas projects to processing plants and separation plants. The transportation of some of them, I mean, if you take away the LNG bit of it, and you have to also recognize that most of this gas comes as natural gas and then is then separated. There are remainders, there are elements of it that goes to communities through pipelines with methane emissions, and again, there is a certain radius within which you cannot operate as a farmer when a pipeline passes through your community. So all of those are concerns. And again, if you look at where processing plants are located, the issues of health within those communities are significant, and they are all human rights concerns that we need to take care of.
All right, thank you. I think we had another question down here. Are there any other questions to fit in? And one back there. Perhaps we could take both questions and then we'll come to the panel to answer them.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Amukodi Silas Kabale. I'm from Uganda in Africa. I'm a project affected person by the ECO project in Uganda. I work with strategic response on environmental conservation, a community-based organization. My question goes specifically to Dennis and Kalabo. When we are talking about Global North is talking about energy transition, global transition, but we are seeing that there are new explorations that are happening within our countries, for example, Uganda. So how can we help our countries also not to be locked into the fossil fuel economy, the way we are seeing? Because today we are seeing, we the youth, we are seeing that our economy may be locked and may not also achieve the energy transition. So how can we help our country? Secondly, it's about the energy transition. They're promoting energy transition, but we don't have policies that can enable us to do the energy transition. For example, the solar policies that we have in Uganda. In our country, when we talk about the solar, it means you're talking about fake products on the market. So how can we help us to have genuine products on the market? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And let's just take the question from this woman here, and then we'll come to both questions. Just make sure we have time.
Hi, my name is Marielle from Energy Intelligence. I have a question about the LNG projects. Would there be a way to transform them into domestic gas projects for the countries? Would that be doable, and how could it be financed rather than exporting the LNG to developed markets? Or are you looking for renewable energy straight away?
Okay, so there's the question about what are the alternatives for economic development for African countries. There's a question about can LNG exports be repurposed for domestic development. And I think the second question was about access to solar technology, was it? Or solar markets? Equality. The quality of the solar panels, I'm sorry, I missed that. Karabo, do you want to take that first?
Yes, so let me start with the fossil fuel dependency of our economies. I think it's going to be important that as we facilitate this just transition, we profile different countries on the continent. I'm from a country, South Africa, where we are dependent on fossil fuels. So it's very much important to profile the levels of dependency for economic development for different countries and how it is that they're going to facilitate the just transitions. It's not reasonable to expect all the countries to just dump fossil fuels and then next thing leapfrog. There are economies that are highly dependent. Nigeria, Senegal just discovered, oil and gas. So how do we ensure that those economies that are dependent transition over time? It's a transition at the end of the day. But we also need to have a more convincing economic model for renewable energy and clean energy. As it stands, the fossil fuel industry is very convincing on the African continent because the resources are there. unfortunately, in terms of clean energy and renewable energy, the selling point has been, let's do it for emissions, let's do it for climate change. We need to start speaking, let's do it for economic development. And the continent has a viable environment and climate to enable that. So I'm of the view that we really need to sell an economic model to our governments. And then in terms of the quality, we need to increase regulatory standards for the quality of tech that is coming onto the continent, because unfortunately a lot of the tech that is coming onto the continent, the quality is compromised. And that's because there's a gap in terms of standardization and regulatory frameworks. We need to strengthen there, but also understand that finance plays a big part. You know, if you want quality material, it means more finance, and the conversation on finance is important. We really need fair financing. We need access to finance so that the quality of technology that we're getting really reflects
what you need. Okay, thank you. I think we've just got 2 minutes left. So Dennis, do you want to address that point about the balance between exports and domestic demand?
Yes, definitely. So we have to recognize that besides the 3 key countries that Vance spoke about in the research, Mozambique, Nigeria, a couple of them, who are looking to export LNG, a number of countries are also looking to import LNG. And in Ghana, there's been the development of a regasification plant in Ghana that is looking to import LNG from Shell. And so we have to realize that the markets are connected. I think we need to repurpose these gas developments for the continent if we have to proceed. And it has to be gas developments that make sense in the short to medium term. We don't have to log ourselves into gas projects that go into the future for external purposes. And so there is demand. There is a West Africa gas pipeline, for instance, that can carry gas from Nigeria into Ghana without having to export it. And so why do we have to develop LNG, for instance? There's enough market on the African continent. And remember, in the ECOWAS region, for instance, there's a power pool that you can generate electricity in Nigeria and share it with the rest of the West African countries. In terms of, I just wanted to touch a bit on the development of current oil and gas projects. I think we have over-optimistic expectations about what oil can do. We have seen what oil cannot do in Nigeria. We have seen what the expectations are in Senegal, for instance, and we just have to manage the expectations and try to diversify our economies into other sustainable investment ventures that will generate long-term value for our people and not get locked down in fossil fuel revenues that have often failed to generate the value that we expect.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dennis, and thanks all for coming. If anyone has further questions, we'll be available outside for a little while.